Okay, everyone, it is time to assume the role. As we talked about in our roles lab earlier, a role is a temporary container that we use to create a session with permissions. And there's two sets of permissions that we use for that. One is the permission policy. What is that role allowed to do? And the next is who or what is allowed to use the role, and we call that the trust policy. The entire process of using a role and creating a session is called assuming a role. Not for any esoteric reason, but because the API call is STS AssumeRole. That's the API call that we make, and that's the permission you need to have to do this. STS stands for the Security Token Service. It's a part of IAM, but it's not the IAM service itself. It's a separate service, and we use it within Amazon, and actually all of Amazon uses this for creating these temporary sessions. It does this by issuing temporary credentials that only work for the session. So the way to think about this is IAM is the service that actually keeps track of all the entitlements and permissions, and STS, the security token service, is what we use to give out temporary permissions. Now, today we're going to assume a role into our security audit account that we created previously, and we're going to use that to create an S3 bucket. Again, this is one that only takes a few minutes, and I'll try and keep the lecture to a few minutes this time as well. For this to work, we need three things to line up in place for us to be able to do this assume role operation. And I think the best way to do this is to subject you to my absolutely horrific handwriting and drawing skills. So let me go ahead and grab the whiteboard here. You guys know when I say whiteboard, I mean iPad, right? All right, so I'm going to go ahead. Let's unlock the iPad. And let's start drawing. Right now, what we are going to start with is our IAM user that we have in our main account. And so in my case, accidentally clicked on making this an eraser. Okay, and so in my case, my user is rmogul. And this is in my management account. So that's the main AWS account that we started everything, that is now the home to the root of our organization. For that, our rmogul user is going to make an API call to the Security Token Service, STS. Now, because I'm making an API call, and actually let me take a step back. The objective is that I'm going to make the API call to the security token service, which is going to give me credentials, which is going to allow me to use a role that we have already existing in our target account. Let me move around a little bit here. So in our security audit account, I'm just going to call it SA, so you don't have to see as much of my handwriting. We have that role that I talked about before when we create our organization, called the Organization Account Access Role. And I'm just doing the initials to save space on my little whiteboard here, but we're going to be writing that out every time. Organization Account Access Role is the name of the role. And my objective here is for my rmogul user to go across, use that role, and then make API calls to do things in that organization account, or do things in that security audit account, which in this case is going to be to create an S3 bucket. Here's what needs to line up for this to work. The first is that our rmogul user, or whatever your username is in your account, has to have its IAM policy. So this is as we were talking about, it is a user, permission policy here. And that has to have the ability to make STS assume role. And again, that's where we come up with the name for this. That is the API call you make to be able to assume the role. So I have to have a permission to allow that STS assume role. Then over here, the actual organization account access role. If you remember, there's two different policies. One is the permissions, which is what is allowed to do. And the next is the trust policy. Now, in this case, we already know the permissions are, full admin, everything star.star. But for what we're doing today, technically, we only need permissions to do some stuff in S3. We're using the role, it's got the full admin, but we would only technically need fewer permissions. What we do need, though, is that trust policy. We're going to look at that when I actually get into the written part of the lab, but that trust policy has to allow, let's do a dotted line here, it has to say that ArmMogul user is allowed to use the role. So the trust policy has to allow it, and the permission policy has to allow the actions you want to take. Now, this is kind of the little secret, or not the secret, but kind of the trick of it that messes people up sometimes the first time they go to do this. It's that you need to have permission in your account to make that API call, and you need to have permission in the destination role to use the role. So it's not even a big deal. And once I explain it, it's super easy. But those two things both have to allow the action. Once all of that is lined up and working, in my ArmMogul account, I make that API call, STS AssumeRole. I have permission to do that, and that goes to the security token service and says, hey, give me the credentials for the organization account access role. Well, the security token service checks to make sure that that trust policy allows me to use that role, and it says, oh, okay, and then it's going to provide me credentials. Now, today, we're going to do all of this in the Amazon portal, in the console. We're not going to see the behind the scenes of the API calls. But if you were actually doing this in an account, you would get an access key, a secret access key, and a security token. And that security token is the thing that has an expiration time on it that goes away. By default, when you go to AssumeRole, it's usually 1 hour that a session will last. But if you're doing it in the console or certain other ways, that time might be a little bit different, might be a little bit longer, might be a little bit shorter, depending on what you're doing. Now, this is like my ugly handwriting. Well, I went ahead and as I was scrolling around, you could probably see I did a nicer diagram of what all of this looks like in the process. And let me scroll over on this one here, and I'll just review kind of how this works. But the first thing is my IAM user, which is ArmMogul, has that policy that allows me to assume the role. I make that call to the security token service. It checks that I have access by looking at, oops, I circled the wrong one there, by looking at the trust policy that says I'm allowed to use that role. Then the security token service issues those temporary credentials back to my user. So it's a little bit different. I've drew it out in a couple of different ways. This one's going to be in the blog post so you can see it. And again, we are going to review all of these IAM policies so that you have a sense of what that looks like. Now, there is one really important note about this. You cannot use your root user account to assume a role into another account. So that root user that we talked about, when we set up our multi-factor authentication and we're told you don't use that, you can't actually assume a role into another account with the root user account. You have to be an IAM user. Another part of this is roles can assume other roles. And we call this role chaining. You can actually have a couple of hops within there. We're not going to do any role chaining today. We are going to do that relatively soon, though. There's some nuances there, like how long a session can be, that we'll get into. So either a user or a role can assume into another role. Let's go over some of the key points here that are associated with this, and then we'll get into the lab. So assuming a role allows an IAM user or another role to use a different set of permissions for a time-limited session. We can assume roles across accounts, which is the way that we are able to gain access to other accounts within our organization without needing a user there. This is actually set up for when we enable single sign-on because that uses the same process. There's just a little bit more magic behind the scenes to talk about on that one. In order to assume a role, you need the permission. Whatever is assuming the role, your user, your role, has to be allowed to assume roles in the first place. So it needs that permission, STS, Security Token Service, assume role. And when you assume a role with the Security Token Service, it's going to give you those time limited credentials, and you can refresh them and stuff. There's other nuances in here. You can set your session times. You can inject policies with fewer permissions. All stuff we'll get to later, but that's the basics of how you assume a role. Lab itself is going to go pretty quick. We're going to log into our management account with our admin user. We're going to assume a role into our security audit account. We're going to create an S3 bucket. So let's get started. Before we actually go ahead and do our assume role and create our S3 bucket, we need two pieces of information. The next is I want to pull out my CloudTrail name because there's a piece of this I need to show you since we're going to make our S3 bucket today that we get our naming set up appropriately. So let's go to Trails. And you can see that I have an existing S3 bucket here with a name. We're not going to replicate that name, but I want you to replicate that structure. So we're going to copy that name out, and I'm going to move that onto my sheet. Now, the reason this is going to be important is that S3 buckets, we haven't talked a lot about S3, but an S3 bucket name, even if we aren't going to make it public, needs to be unique globally on the internet. That's kind of an important piece because if you were to make it public, and there's a lot of very legitimate reasons to have public S3 buckets like hosting websites, then that name can't overlap with somebody else having that name. You'll notice the structure here, it's AWS CloudTrail logs is kind of the default. We could have called it anything we want, but that's the default. Then there's the account ID for your management account, and then some random characters there. What I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to change those random characters and I don't know, we'll call it A. We're not going to have a public bucket anyway. It's just a good practice to do this. So GH78S, I don't know, just something that is going to be, pretty random that I don't have to worry about somebody else trying to replicate my bucket name. Now mine's going to be public. You'll all be able to see this, but I'm never going to make this bucket public. So there is a little bit of risk to me in the training account. Somebody now is on the internet could try and hammer on this bucket. I'll just make sure that I'm good with my policies and permissions to protect myself. But you would want to go ahead and keep that stuff private on your own. You wouldn't want to, be promoting these bucket names. It turns out a little obscurity actually can help your security. Going back to the AWS console. With that account ID and with that bucket name, I'm ready to assume role into my other account. Just to be safe, I'm going to switch regions because we're going to create our S3 bucket in the US West 2 Oregon region. To the greatest degree possible, I do everything in Oregon. And as I talked about very, very early when we started these labs, I just tend to run into fewer issues with service limits or running out of resources because Amazon does have if things are going to get crowded, they tend to get crowded in that Virginia region first. In the console, it's really easy to assume a role into another account. Click on that upper right-hand corner, and in that drop-down, you can see switch role. You'll notice I in my browser have done this already, and it keeps track of that history. Oh, and you know what? There's one more ID we need. Let me scroll down. I'm going to go to Organization. And I need the account ID for that security audit account. Oops, let's go ahead and let's copy this out. Copy. And I'm going to go back to my scrap sheet. I'm going to paste that in. And I'm going to label it just so I know which account is which. So that's my security audit account. All right. Now I can go in that upper right-hand corner again. And let's go to switch role. And here's the process. This is just basically filling in a form that's going to do that assume role operation for you. The account ID is what account am I switching into? I could actually do this in my same account, but in our case, we are moving to a different account, and I want to make sure that that matches up with my security audit account, and it does. Then the role, and it's the organization account. You can see it's trying to fill in it already because I've already done it. So let me just back out and tie in there. And so I'm going to copy and paste this onto the cheat sheet just so you can see it. This is in the blog post to make it easy, but it's that organization account access role. I actually had it set up for a keyboard shortcut on all my computers because I do it so often. Then the display name, and I'm going to say security audit, and I'm going to give it a green color, and that's what's going to show up as I'm logged in. So let's switch role. And you see, this is actually what shows up now. It tells me the name of the account that I'm in. That display name is because I typed in security audit. So whatever I pick as the display name shows up there. And you can see that it shows up down here as well as my role history. And this is what's cool is like if you're doing a lot of this will keep, I think, 5. You can just click on them to bounce around. And you'll notice that label, that color, and that name lets me know I'm now operating in a different account. And I can tell because I don't have permissions to see anything in organizations really, because again, I'm in a sub account which doesn't have those permissions. So I am now operating with the permissions of that organization account access role, and I'm doing that in my security audit account, which is the account with that ID 211. So I started here, and now I'm here. Okay. Now we're going to create our S3 bucket. So I'm going to go to S3. Click on it. And when we're done with this, I'm going to show you what this looks like in Identity and Access Management. I'm going to click Create Bucket. And we want to create it in our US West Oregon region because that's where we're going to set everything up. And there's a lot of settings and stuff here we don't really need. But we do need a name. And this is where I'm going to pull the name out of. Now, you'll notice again, why am I using the account ID of a different account in the name? Just a personal preference. For me, it's because that's the organization account ID. And you could, if you wanted to, make that the ID of this account. But for our consistency purposes, I'm going to leave it as that. This is pretty much it. We're going to go with all of the default settings. These are all things we're going to talk about later. Particularly because in our next lab, we're going to spend more time talking about S3 and resource policies. The thing to know is that this bucket's going to have nothing in it. No one's going to have access to it. It's not going to be public. And I just click Create Bucket. And hopefully it did work. It successfully created. On the off chance you somehow picked a name of somebody else that's not going to work, you would actually get an error there. But we have that here. That's it for the core of the lab. But I want to move over into IAM and remind you of what these policies look like on the role. So if I go to the IAM dashboard and I go to roles, and I'm going to go to that organization account access role. You notice trusted entities, account ID, that is the account ID for my management account. But there's some details on this that you're going to want to see that are kind of important. So the permission policy is everything that this account can do, and we talked about it. By default, Organizations creates the organization account access role and gives you full admin. And then the trust relationship is who or what is allowed to use the role. In this case, it says the management account and then root. I thought you said, Rich, that you can't use the root account. You can't. This is bad nomenclature, which actually translates to mean that anyone or anything in the management account can assume this role. Obviously, this is one reason you want to lock down your management account because you don't want anyone being able to assume full administrative access to a sub account to another account. The other is that I kind of wonder if Amazon regrets picking this name because it is confusing. It doesn't mean root. It just means the entire account. What's cool is you could actually lock this down. We're going to do that in some future labs. We're just not going to worry about it today. But you could restrict it to only certain IAM users or only certain IAM roles could use this role. But that's the important piece here. Permissions, the organization account access role can do anything. And trust relationships, anything from my management account or anyone from my management account can use this role. That's pretty much it. Hope you guys like this one. It is very quick and easy. We logged in with AssumeRole. We learned how to transition to another account. We created an S3 bucket. Next week, we're going to create and add a resource-based policy to this bucket. And then the final week, we're going to go ahead and switch over our CloudTrail to make it an organization CloudTrail and move all of the log files into this bucket instead of keeping them in the management account. See you in a week. Hey everyone, just a quick follow-on note. Something I almost forgot in the main lab is when you're logged in to get back to your management account or whatever account you switch roles from, just click on that upper right-hand corner, go switch back. This will dump you exactly into the user interface of where you were, but now you're, oh, come on, got to work with me. Switch back. There we go. It drops you right back into where you were supposed to be. No idea why that didn't work the first time. Now you can see I'm in my management account. I don't have the color banding, and I don't have that human readable name that was added in there. That's all. Have a great week.